name is Jenny, and I am your IRB director. How many of you are familiar with what the IRB is? Maybe I should ask that reverse. How many of you don't know what the IRB is? Okay, perfect. Historically, and I'm going to give a really abridged version to some atrocities, so please just bear with me. Historically, people in power have, as we know, abused said power and taken advantage of people who were disenfranchised in the past. And the US is no different, and we still do it today. The Nazis did a lot of unethical research on their prisoners, and then the US did a lot of unethical research on are people that live in the United States that we would determine weren't equitable at the time, especially in the 30s. And we got caught, and as a result, we created a law that needed to be put in place to govern all research that was federally funded. And this law said that we as researchers, when we're doing work with humans, need to make sure that we are informing people of what's going on, that we're respecting them as individuals, that our research is doing good, and we balance the risks and benefits overall. And then, because nobody ever really listens to a philosophical like, hey, do good, they put some teeth behind it where they outlined what actually needs to happen. So now NC State has an IRB, which is an office and a board of diverse people who reviews all of the research that North Carolina State University does that involves human subjects. That's everything from surveys to clinical trials to exercise studies, etc. And our job is to review all of the proposed research for ethical issues, potential harm to participants, and then help guide you through some of that practicality to make sure that your work is actually doing good and you're not succumbing to any pitfalls. Does that very brief overview help give insight to what our office does? There's a couple things that I want you to know. Is one, IRBs have really crappy reputations. Many IRBs are dysfunctional. Many IRBs don't have a perspective of working as a social justice unit. And many IRBs are so overworked and overwhelmed that they just don't have the time or energy to be able to focus on some of the areas of ethics and inclusion that we do. And they mostly focus on regulatory stuff. But then other IRBs have enough staff or have the perspective that we want to make sure that the research that we're having associated with our university or our company, we want to make sure that that represents the values of our institution, that all of the things that we're putting forward, we have the time and energy to help our researchers go through and partner with them to design their work with them to promote inclusion, to make sure everything's ethical going on, to make sure you're doing things the easiest way instead of the hardest way, and really to bring to life those practicalities of your research. Because frankly, if you're in school or even right now, if you're never really taught how to practically do research and you're not ever really taught how to speak IRB, and we are the people who like you give your information to and literally can't start your project until we give you the approval. So we try to make a lot of guidance for you on our site and all that kind of stuff, or we'll work with you to help you bring your research to life. Before we talk about ways to design inclusion into your study and to think about your study ethically and inclusively, are there any goals that you have or things that you're hoping to get out of this conversation today, or any questions I can answer for you before we move on? I drank that to give appropriate pause. Excellent. So when you think about designing your research study, what are ways that you think that you can incorporate equity and inclusion?
There's a, do you want me to narrate what's in the chat, or can you, okay. Biggest challenge is getting into schools. And this question is why I came to this session. And someone, Angela Novak, wants to do research with kiddos.
Okay.
So that's what we got.
Sure.
You can unmute if
So
that helps. And for the record, for the audience, if this is helpful, I'm actually a professor and I came to this session. So for those of you that are students, the questions don't end when you're done with a degree. So don't feel that, you know, this is continual. This is a lifetime journey of asking questions. But
IRB.
you know, yeah, absolutely. So so I wrote my biggest challenge is getting into schools, and you know, with equity and inclusion, you really want to get student perspectives. I tell my students, so I teach education courses, that if you want to know what's going on with kids, you ask kids. If you want to know how they feel or what their perspective is, you ask them, right?
Yeah.
But getting into schools, oh my God. So, and then there's getting it through campus IRBs and then getting it through school IRBs. And so for anyone who is, you know, I know with this NC State Symposium, it's not all education, it can be in a variety of, but if you want to do any research with kiddos and getting it through the school. And so for me, for equity and inclusion and getting any kind of child perspective, it's really challenging. And so do you have any insight into
Sure. And we can set up a one-on-one too to talk through your research specifically. And what
well,
I've
for the
seen.
record, I'm jumping on from another university. So
oh, that's also okay. You can also just call me and talk to me. It's fine. There's stuff that the IRB regulates, and then there's stuff that other people just put hard stops in between. The IRB determines and reviews and approves your research by asking 3 questions. Is it research? Is it human subjects research? And is NC State your IRB of record? And if we answer those 3 questions, then we know how we're going to regulate your research and what regulations apply to what. And we have a lot of sessions offered through the library that you should check out, where we go into detail. We teach you how to do IRB stuff, etc. You'll find it really valuable. But once we do that, we then have to review your study, and some of that includes how you get access to stuff. So we don't regulate necessarily what you access and how you access it if there's no conflict there, but you do have to describe your relationship or work with a gatekeeper. And so we do a lot of education research here, and each county of schools does it differently. Wake County has their own kind of research ethics board. And I always say, go to Wake County first, or talk to us first about what you want to have, go to Wake County and then come to us. But Wake County sometimes wants it reversed. And then other counties don't have that kind of review board, and you just need to, message their principal or their superintendent and they'll let you in. So what you're talking about here is a gatekeeper problem and how you can develop those relationships. We, as the IRB, just need to know, are you allowed to go into the school and who gave you that permission? As where the gatekeeper can be a hard stop. And sometimes the gatekeepers also have secondary level of review where they want to make sure that they're addressing everything with the students. And so really it's just whether or not you've got that relationship going on with your gatekeeper that's the harder part. I know that doesn't do a good job of answering your question, and I can help to brainstorm more one-on-one, even if you're with another university. But really, you're stuck at a gatekeeper issue, and you just need to flex those relationships that you can make.
Well, and I also thought that by asking this, other people might have the same kind of. I thought it might be a good global question.
Yeah. Gatekeepers can hold up research in different ways and for very different reasons, and some are really good reasons and some aren't. And so people, I think, underestimate the role of a gatekeeper, and I think that could really be emphasized.
Jenny, there's a comment in the chat from Brooke Peters that says, with equity and inclusion, I think the biggest thing is the researcher doing the work to figure out their blind spots, figuring out the larger context that their research exists in, so that they can figure out how to ask their questions without being disruptive or doing unintentional harm.
Yep. So I'm going to answer the kiddo question first, just so I don't forget it. And then I want to walk you through a couple of things that we think promote inclusion and equity in creating and research design stuff. So when we are thinking, okay, this is an ideally designed study, I'll talk you through what we think about in those ways. But first, if you want to involve kiddos, you can totally do research with kiddos. It just requires, for the most part, what's called mid-level review, which means the regulations apply and you would need to justify a couple things. But we do research with kids all of the time. We have some example assent forms on our site that are written at different grade levels that you can access and apply to your study, so that creating the regulatory required information is easier for you. And then the level, if it needs more intensity of a review, that's just going to be based on your research question. So if you're asking kiddos, about if they learned math right or whatever, that's gonna be fine. But if you're asking kiddos if their teacher's super racist, that's probably gonna go to the next level of review, right? It's gonna be able to be done because we really promote research here, and we're not scared of riskier or controversial research. We just need to make sure we're balancing the research design to protect the people that need protecting. Does that help answer your kiddo question? Yeah. So when the IRB is reviewing research to approve, there's 8 or 9 criteria that are spelled out in the regulations. And they're very vague. Well, some are vague. Some are like, the risks are balanced with the benefits. Consent is appropriately sought. This is sound research design, right? And the reviewer has to justify why they're saying yes to all of those things. However, that can really change based on how you're designing your study, who was at the table when you designed it, what the research question is, how you're choosing your methods to answer that research question. And at each one of these points of design, that's where inclusion and equity are going to be needed. So if we're thinking about, I have a document that I can send you all. I don't know why I didn't do it beforehand, that kind of breaks up theoretical questions that we want you to think about when you're designing your research. So for example, if we're going to start with funding, where's your funding coming from and what are their values, right? If you're trying to do research on promoting equity, right, you're probably not going to want to use Trump funding, right? Like that's probably somewhere where you're not going to go because he's got projected values of not equity. How does your research partnership further issues of gender equity, gender and then equity as well. What is your research partnership saying? What is it telling the world about your questions and your values? What are your funders' restrictions and what's their agenda? If you want to do good research, you shouldn't be partnering with shady folks, or you shouldn't be partnering or getting money from people who don't exhibit those values, right? So you want to make sure you're asking yourself those questions. So for example, if I'm a participant and I say, oh, you're doing this whole cool research on this, and I feel like you're going to really bring my voice out, and then I see that your funder is like the exact opposite of who would be supporting that, and they're public about it, I'm not going to really trust you, and I'm not going to have that foundation of trust. So you're starting at the fundamentals of who your partners are and thinking about what those values are telling people. The next one I would talk about is research questions. How are you coming up with your research questions? Do they promote equity and inclusion? Do they, are they actually subversive? Is your research providing strategies and solutions? When you come up with your findings and you make your recommendations, are they going to be related to gender? Are they going to be related to equity? Are they going to be promoting inclusion or something else, right? And are you, if you're specifically targeting actual topics of equity or gender, because you can answer questions completely unrelated to gender and equity and still promote inclusion in your study, right? Or you can also tackle topics about equity and gender, right? So if you're doing a study on high schoolers who use a lot of engendered language and all this kind of humor that turns into kind of bullying, when you're asking questions about gender, are you actually asking about gender terms, or are you conflating sex and gender? And in doing so, are you then alienating the people that you're targeting, right? If I'm about to take a survey about gender and you say, what's your gender, male, female, I'm going to close the survey, right? Because now I'm like, well, you know nothing. You are researching nothing. You know nothing. You've showed no respect for me whatsoever. And so those are just basic research design at things that you can put in place that show your participants that you value them. It shows your participants that your agenda is going to follow through with the questions you're asking. And if your research study is actually on inclusion or on gender or on race, and your demographics are offensive, we will stop that and say, no, you can't research this and ask this like this. This is actually putting your participants in harm's way. Go ahead, Joy. You're muted.
Yeah. Jennie, can you talk a little bit more about research questions being subversive and what that might look like?
Oh, okay. Good follow-up question. I see where it came from. I'm trying to think of an example of that. Oh crap, I don't have a good example. I don't have a good example right now. I guess one that, I don't know if this really comes to mind. I mean, I don't know if this is a good example, but we had someone that was looking at training or diversity training within the military field, right? And the research question was going to be all about, is this training promoting diversity, inclusion, happening here, etc. But one of the questions that they asked of the participants, if they identified as trans, and a memorandum had just come out that said you can't be trans in the military. So now we have this study that's looking at inclusion in the military, and you're generating data that's going to get somebody dishonorably discharged, right? So this is an example where the person just didn't even think about it. It's threw demographic questions in there. But because it came through us, we were like, what are you doing about this problem? And they were like, oh my God, I didn't even see that. Or they were like, that's not a problem. And I'm like, oh, problem. So, you have to really pay attention to what the data you're collecting, if it matches your research question. If your research question is maybe like you want to assess people's gun violence, like sensitivity to gun violence, but then all of your questions are about the NRA and not at all about gun violence, that's going to be ways that, you're like, oh, this feels weird. So maybe that's what I meant by submersive, or no, submersive, that's the wrong word. The other one.
Subversive.
Thank you. Struggle is real today. So you really want to make sure that you're not inadvertently excluding people, using language that's excluding people, or putting people in harm's way because you've got a blind spot going on. When we think about designing your research with equity, inclusion, we want to think about your research methods. Who's the makeup of the research team? For example, we had folks, we do a lot of bra design at NC State. I don't know if you know, this is very exciting. We even have a boob mannequin, so that doesn't always have to be humans, the best. So we do a lot of bra research here, but before we had said mannequin, and it was maybe like my first year here, it was these two guys, and they just wanted to see if the bra held, but they wanted to have these ladies jump on a trampoline with their boobs just jumping, right? And then put the bra on, see how it went. And it's very normal to look at boobs in these different states, right? But I was like, are these just two dudes doing this, right? I was like, I'm gonna need a minute, because the man show was a thing, and I was like, we're gonna need to talk about the makeup of your research team and the comfort level of your participants. But because these guys only had the straight up vision for the bra study and weren't thinking about the humans involved, they didn't really think about this comfort level, right? So if we're going to have people strip down half naked or just be naked, then we want them to have a choice of the research team member that maybe is in the room, right, while they're doing this or taking the measurements. So, who is on the research team and why? Who isn't? What perspective are you missing there? And is that relevant to your study? Does the makeup promote inclusion? So for example, if you've got a whole research team full of old white dudes, that's not really promoting inclusion. Why don't we pull in some other perspectives there? If you have a research team that's all made up of white females, let's pull in some other perspectives there. You know, we don't want to have a white feminism problem. So we want to make sure that your research team is diverse so that your design doesn't have any blind spots, and so that you're actually asking the questions that are needed and you're not assuming any kind of vulnerability and gap for people. Let's see. And then the last part of who's at the table is, where is the expertise coming from? So it's not just about, you know, our own physical internal makeup of who we are, but like how we're educated and trained. You know, where is our training and expertise coming from? What perspectives aren't there? You know, do we need a lay perspective to help say like what practically happens? So they're not just scientific. Do you need somebody who's, pardon the terrible language, from a softer science, from a harder science? I don't know what to call that. You know, so that we have these other perspectives. I find our IRB board is better when we have a representative from every field versus just one field, right? So when our psychologist is missing from the table of discussion, the conversation's real different. And so we need to make sure that your research team is made up of people with proper insight. Do you have any questions about the makeup of research team stuff? In this case, silence means no. Excellent. So the target population that you're
selecting. I have a question. Sorry I was trying to hit the unmute button. I wasn't fast enough. Okay. So when composing your research team, I'm nervous to ask this, but I'm just going to put it out there. What if you are in a field that just isn't diverse? For example, I'm library faculty, which is like 98% white women.
Yep.
We're typically doing research with other librarians about library things.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts on that?
So the IRB world too is like 90% white ladies, right? So how the heck do we get diversity around the table when that happens? And this goes back to intentionality of who you want to have advise your project. So here's what the IRB does when we don't have the expertise. So if something comes my way and we don't have the proper representation or perspective, or we're just too homogenous, I reach out to multiple different people of different backgrounds, right? So then I say, hey, can you consult on this? And then they will look at my research design, or in this case, your study, and say, here's where your blind spots are, here's where your gaps are. You can do the same with your research, right? If there's all white ladies around the table, and let's say you're looking at women in WIC, right? Then you can say, okay, let's look at what the demographic population is of women in WIC, age, race, you know, socioeconomic status can be pretty flat. And then you would say, let's ask some people of that research or of that demographic or varying demographics to look at our study design and our questions and see what we're missing. Those are just parts of feasibility studies that will help you design your research better. And it's a great way to engage participants. Does that help?
It does. Thank you. It gives me a lot of food for thought, for sure.
Yeah, and we can also talk one-on-one. So one of the things about the IRB full board that I'm really proud of is, like, you know those like old school definitions? No, not old school definitions. You know those definitions of diversity where you literally have an individual next to another individual who they're complete opposites, next to another individual, whatever, and everyone thinks it's just going to be conflict because no one's listening to each other? Well, that's legitimately how the board is made up. The IRB chair and I specifically put people in places that have divergent opinions, divergent expertise, different backgrounds of every kind. And then we sit around a table and we all have to come to agreement on your study if it needs that level of review. And it's like truly working definition of what diversity can be when we're taking into perspectives what needs to be taken care of in there. And so I think doing the same thing with your research study team is a good way to do it. And if you don't have someone on the study team, you can certainly consult. And then when you talk about that in your publications, people will be like, oh, they like legit crossed their T's and dotted their I's. And your participants will feel that difference. They'll feel seen, they'll feel cared for, and they'll feel paid attention to. And you won't have that sense of imperialism, I guess, where it's just Western culture coming to study whatever, or rich culture doing this, or academia doing that, right? Because you've actually, from the ground up, included the people that need to be there. Does that answer your question a little better? Thanks, Jennifer. So the next question that I want you guys to think about is, who is your target population? And so this actually gets at the idea of justice, where it's the idea that the people who like take on the burden of your research need to be the people who would receive said benefits from your research. So I typically start these like conversations out with people about why they're doing their research on questions like, why do you even care about this? And usually it comes down to something about, I care about this human and what affects this human. So when that happens, I want you to design your research in a way that will show care for that human from beginning to end, so that the data you get can then fold back on them and show them care. So your target population has to be relevant to your research question. If you are studying likingness of cheese, right, and who likes what kind of cheese, you don't just get to target students for that because they're easy access to you. You have to actually justify your target population. You know, and this is rooted in the deep disenfranchisement throughout the history of the world. So in the IRB application, you're going to see some very pointed questions about, why the hell are you targeting these people? Usually, and thankfully nowadays, there's a legit reason for targeting the people you're targeting. But, you know, when you're thinking about your target population, you need to think about why you're targeting them. So for example, we do research here on software, and most people target either Android users or Apple users. What do you think, who's left out when you target Apple users? The answer is poorer people, right? So funny. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, Android users are left out. But more specifically, if you're looking at the demographics of people who use Apple and people who use Android, there's a real socioeconomic split between the two. So if you're just targeting this group of people, you need to say why and justify why, because you're leaving out a whole bunch. And we say this, and I use this as an easier example, because historically minority folks aren't researched properly. They're either used as a research or as people to inform research for the majority of folks, or they're misused in general. So the research questions don't focus on benefiting people from minority statuses in general. So now making sure that your question reflects their needs is what you're going to be wanting to do when you design your work. When it comes to selecting people, maybe you have 100 people sign up for your study, but only 20 can fit in. Well, who gets to be that 20? Why are some 20, more fit for you than others? So you have to design, who gets to be in your study and not, because sometimes being in your study could be a really big benefit. So if we're going with an education example, maybe you're providing really cool math tutoring. And which of the 20 kids or which of the 100 kids get to be the lucky 20 that get this math tutoring, and why are they selected over anybody else? And so you really want to make sure that you have equity in who you're selecting and why, not just who you're casting your net of selection to. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'll go with you after that one. In this case, I'm taking silence as a yes. So then the other ones, and I'll go through a little bit further with them because we're at time here, is that you want to make sure that when you're consenting, your language is appropriate. You're not being offensive. You're not having people sign consent forms that could put them in harm, right? So we're not going to allow you to do a study that says, in order to be in the study, you have to be gay and you have to be an undocumented immigrant. And then we're not going to have you sign that bottom of that consent form. And that's because that's going to put you at risk. So at every choice about your research design, we're thinking about the inclusion problem and also the risks to participants in there. Now, I know we're at time, right? Is that 10? So feel free to ask me any questions. I'll send you this document. I don't know why I didn't do it before. But if you have stuff that's specific to you, or if you have questions about what I talked about here, or maybe something I said kind of pissed you off, just send me an email to irb-director@ncsu.edu, and I would love to talk with you one-on-one about it.
Thank you so much, Jennie, and thank you for all of you who attended. Jennie will be back at 3:30, I believe. Everyone look forward to that. And now we can transition, hand off to Corey and Tatiana. I believe you're hosting our coffee mug conversation.
Ooh.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, guys.